The other announcement I wanted to point out is that there are readings posted in the reading video section that you got. So the Hidden Life of Trees, United We Stand, Divided We Fall, is again just a few pages and really easy, short read, but it's talking about trees and their associated mycorrhizal fungi. So I wanted to make sure that you read that. The second thing, How Plants Crawled Out of the Sea, that's like a 2-minute video. I don't even think it's a full 2 minutes. So it's really short, very to the point. And looking at how we have this, it's kind of funny that they spend under 2 minutes to describe a very profound process, which is getting algae and then thinking about the transition out of the ocean and onto terrestrial settings. That's a huge, huge shift in when you think about how plants had to colonize land after growing and surviving the ocean for millions of years. So please watch that little short clip. This next thing, mycorrhizal fungi and colonization of land by ancient plants, basically just reading the summary section. So you don't have to read the whole section, the whole paper. Just read that little portion. And then the Word document, Ancient Algae Knew How to Survive, that kind of goes hand in hand with that short little 2-minute video clip. Okay. So these are all really short, but I think are trying to get you to think about, in a good way, get you to think about this big shift from going from the ocean environment to land. And so when we think about the bryophytes, so when we think about that phylum of plant, we're thinking about the mosses, which is the top left picture that you're seeing. And then the middle picture is an example of a liverwort. And the bottom picture is an example of hornworts. So those 3 groups of plants are all considered bryophytes. And I'm guessing most of you are most familiar with mosses. So that's why I like to start with them and talk a little bit about those. So in general, though, when you think about the bryophytes and you think about land plants, the current thought is that they are descended from a green algae, although it's so Chara or Chara, depending on who's talking. I tend to say Chara. So that's an image of that green algae, but some plant biologists put Chara into its own separate phylum. Just be aware. So it depends on what resource you're reading or who you're talking to. I was taught that they come from green algae. Chara is a green algae, but I have in the notes section to this slide that some biologists will put them in their own phylum. So just be aware of that. This bulleted list that you see, this is all things that describe Chara. And so when you look at Chara and look at its biology, all of these will be true. So they have the cell wall. When you look at the cell wall of Chara, it's made up of cellulose. It has phytochrome pigments for being able to tell how long it's in the day versus how long it's in the night period. It has chlorophyll pigments, A and B. When you crack open a chloroplast and look inside, you'll see those thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplast. I don't really emphasize this next bullet, but they list this out all the time. This has to do with how they go through cell division. They look at that very carefully and whether or not the spindle stays or dissolves away, so to speak. When they are having a lot of extra sugar production, they will pack it away as starch. And then they'll store that away in their amyloplasts. So they store their starch in plastids. And then if you look at the sperm of this plant, when it's going through sexual reproduction, the flagella are very similar to sperm flagella that you see in other higher plants. Okay, so these are all characteristics of Chara, and the reason I listed those out is because now when we shift into the bryophytes, you're going to see some of these same characteristics showing up in the bryophytes. And so that's why they think Chara was the immediate ancestor to the bryophytes. Okay, it doesn't want to advance. There we go. Okay, so this is a phylogenetic tree trying to show the relationships among the different land plants. And here you can see on the very base of the tree is the idea that Chara is the ancestor to all of the land plants. And then you can see if you follow the first three swooping lines from the base, those are the groups of plants that we're going to be looking at in terms of the bryophytes. So the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. So what this is saying is that they are, evolutionarily speaking, bryophytes are very ancient. They are toward the base of the phylogenetic tree of the terrestrial plants. So they evolved first before we start talking about gymnosperms and angiosperms, which came much later in evolutionary time. Okay, so the bryophytes made it onto land, were able to colonize and adapt and survive. So if you look at bryophytes and you try to come up with some characteristics to describe them, it's a good rule of thumb that they prefer to be in moist habitats. They like to be in kind of perennial, frequently moist habitats. And so now, having said that, they're pretty good at surviving drought periods, and we'll get into that a little bit. Any of the bryophytes that you look at are very petite. They're very small, low to the ground or whatever substrate they're growing on. They do not get tall at all. And so they often get overlooked. If you're just out hiking around, they're very easy to ignore because you'd have to like get down on your hands and knees to look in the forest undergrowth to find many of these. It's really important that you appreciate there's no true roots, no true leaves. How we define roots and leaves, they don't really have that. And so what that means is that in place of the roots, they have these structures that are referred to as rhizoids. And they're just epidermal cells that are kind of growing into the substrate that the plant is on. And their job is just to anchor the plant. Rhizoids they don't act like normal root systems. You know, normal root systems are in the soil and they suck up water and minerals. That's not what rhizoids do. All right, so they're not true roots. They just kind of help anchor and stabilize the plant. It's also really important that you realize they don't have true vascular tissue. So they don't have xylem. They don't have phloem. So they lack that vascular system through their body. And that creates some unique issues for them because now they don't have that long distance transport internally, like, you know, our blood vessel systems or the xylem and phloem that you think about with, you know, we've been talking about xylem and phloem since, you know, the very first week of this class. Now, some plants, some of the bryophytes have modified tissue that they've labeled as leptoids and hydroids. And I'm not really, you don't need to memorize those two words. It's more important that you understand that they don't have true vascular tissue, so no true xylem or phloem. There are a few bryophytes that have modified tissue that are called leptoids and hydroids that seem to help with transport. So they're kind of similar to xylem and phloem in some ways, but they're very, very different in other ways. So what that means is if a plant, well, all living things have to have water. So if it can't have true roots and it can't take up water from the soil, then how is it getting its water? And what we find is that's why they like to hang out in moist habitats, because they pretty much just rely on moisture coming from anywhere. Rain, fog, snow, sleet, a damp soil, certainly they can get a little bit from that too. But basically they just wait for their whole body to get wet. And so a lot of it has to do with rain and fog. And so they just absorb water through their whole body. They don't have specialized roots to do that job. And the minerals they get from like dust particles that are in the air or soil particles that get splashed up onto. And so, again, no true way to get access to the soil water, deep in the soil minerals, unless it's splashed onto them in some way. Most bryophytes do have a slow growth rate. So they are limited because of some of these issues. They don't really grow super fast. The one exception is Sphagnum peat moss. That one, for a bryophyte, can grow actually quite rapid. When you compare Sphagnum peat moss to all the other types of bryophytes, they kind of win in terms of their quick growth rate. Okay, what else can we say about all bryophytes? Let's see. They all have chlorophyll A and B. So when they're doing photosynthesis, those are the chlorophyll pigments that they have. If they are doing lots of photosynthesis and make a lot of sugar, extra sugar, they can store it up as starch. We're going to find that some, like algae, that I'm not going to have a chance to really talk too much about. Algae don't always store their sugars as starch. So we always look to see how do these plants store their sugars? Is it as starch or some other molecule? The sperm are motile. They have flagella, and they're definitely motile. And then this last bullet point is really important. We say that they need free water in order to have fertilization. So that means in order to get that motile sperm to reach the egg, you need free water. Now, we're going to see later, as we talk about some of these other plant groups, they don't need free water, some of these groups, but bryophytes definitely do. So they need some kind of rain action, sleet, something to get that sperm splashed or somehow moving in a film of water over to where the egg is located. Okay, so those are some general characteristics of bryophytes. Now, the other huge concept that we need to start thinking about is this one: alternation of generations. So this concept is going to follow us now through the rest of the semester. Okay, so it's really important that you learn this now and get it into your long-term memory, because it's going to show up from this point forward all the way to the angiosperms. Luckily, the terminology is pretty similar throughout the whole process. So once you learn it, it's pretty much you're good to go. All right, so at least they don't keep switching up terminology when we get into the next group of plants. You're going to see mostly the same terms. And then there will be a handful of additional terms. So all plants will have this so-called alternation of generations. Now, what's being shown here are the two generations. Up top in the tan area, that's the so-called gametophyte phase, gametophyte. Anytime you see P-H-Y-T-E in a word, that means plant. Gameto is referring to the gametes. Gametes are the sperm and the egg. Okay, gametes are the sperm and the egg. So the gametophyte generation, and then down here in the blue area, that's the sporophyte generation. So we're going to see that plants will alternate their generations. Sporophyte, gametophyte, sporophyte, gametophyte. And what's causing that alteration or alternation are these two concepts here: the idea of fertilization and meiosis. Okay, fertilization and meiosis. So what we see here with the gametophyte phase, when the plants are in that part of their life cycle, what they're going to be doing is making gametes, which are sperm and egg. So that's what you see here. Sperm and egg are what we call haploid, just like the sperm and egg that humans produce are haploid. That means those cells have half the number of chromosomes. Half the number of chromosomes. So we represent that by N, the italicized N. Some people put a 1 in front of it, but most people just shorten it down to just the italicized N to refer to haploid, which means half the number of chromosomes. The sporophyte generation, you can see it's written as 2N, 2N. So that means in the sporophyte phase of their life, they're back up to the full complement of chromosomes. So most of your body, I guess you could say it's in the sporophyte phase. Most of the cells of your body are diploid, 2N. And it's only your sperm and your egg that are half the number of chromosomes. Okay. So in order to shift from the gametophyte phase to the sporophyte phase, you have to have the sperm finding the egg. And once that happens, then we call that fertilization. So if you have a haploid egg and a haploid sperm fusing, now you're back up into the diploid state. You have 2N. Okay, so fertilization gets you back into the sporophyte phase, or 2N. The immediate cell that they talk about is called the zygote. So sperm and egg unite, then you say it's fertilized, the egg is fertilized, and now we say it's a zygote. And then the zygote will develop into the embryo. And then you're going to get lots of growth, mitosis, mitosis, mitosis. That's cell growth, division, so that you can get the sporophyte portion of the life cycle. Then eventually that sporophyte phase, during the life of that, you're going to get spores produced. Before those spores are fully mature and before the spores get fully released out, they have to go through meiosis. And if you think back to basic biology, meiosis is the idea of taking a full complement of chromosomes and going through meiosis cuts it in half. So by the time meiosis is all done, you have half the number of chromosomes in those spores. So in order to go from the sporophyte to the gametophyte, which is going from the diploid to the haploid, you must go through meiosis. That's the only way to get it to happen. Okay. So as you're learning this and studying this, I highly encourage you to draw this out over and over and over. As you're drawing it out, talk it out. And the next several slides, we're going to go through this in more detail. Okay? But this is not going away. This is going to follow us through the rest of the semester. Okay. All right. So let's take this idea now and let's put it into context of the actual bryophyte plant. So how does a bryophyte do this? Well, first of all, it's important to realize, so what we're describing here is the sexual life cycle of bryophytes, because there's sperm and egg being produced and fertilization. So we're talking about its sexual life cycle. Just be aware that most bryophytes, when they go through reproduction and growth, it's actually that they clone themselves, so just be aware of that. So you can take moss and divide it up and put it in a new habitat, and it will survive and grow and keep growing and spreading out. All right, so they can just clone themselves, and that's very, very common. But in biology classes, we like to look at how do organisms go through sexual reproduction? How do they do that? What are the key characteristics? And that's a defining feature that gets us to classify, oh, you know, they all do it this way, so they're all related to each other in that manner. So if you're, yes. Yes. So we're going to find that a lot of the groups of plants that we're going to be studying in this class, they have motile sperm, and you need free water in order for the sperm to find the egg. It's kind of remarkable. Once I describe this more, I always am left with the idea, how do they find each other, that sperm and that egg. It just seems so random, but it happens. And so, and I think, and then as we get into the gymnos and angiosperms, you're going to see a shift where you don't need free water anymore. And that's kind of like a huge leap in the evolutionary process, believe it or not. So I'm hoping to convince you as we work through this why that's such a big leap. But right now, the motile sperm idea, and again, that's probably why they do so much asexual reproduction, because when you look at how they have to do this sexually, it's pretty challenging. So if you're out hiking around and you're looking at mosses through most of their lifespan, that they're alive and kicking during the summer, spring, summer, fall. In the winter here, they tend to go dormant. But what we say is that the gametophyte is the dominant phase. So as you're hiking around, that's the bryophyte plant body that you see. It's in its gametophyte phase, which is weird because really, when you think about us, like we're walking around as a human, and most of us is the sporophyte phase, if you want to think of it that way, because most of us is in the diploid state. But when you look at a moss, all that tissue, almost all that tissue that you're seeing is the gametophyte phase. And that's half the number of chromosomes in that bryophyte plant body. So when you look at why, what's their big goal as they're carrying out photosynthesis and getting access to water and minerals, of course they're doing all of that. But again, if you're going to go through sexual reproduction, the ultimate goal of the gametophyte phase is to produce gametes. So that's their job. Their job is to make egg and sperm. And so they will be busy doing that through the summer season. Okay, so this terminology, again, you need to know, but it's going to follow it. So once we learn it, you're good. So the gametophytes, some of where they're going to produce the sperm is in what we call antheridia. It's a specialized portion of the gametophyte body. All right, just like with sperm production in humans, you have a specialized tissue for that. Same with the bryophytes. So antheridia produce sperm. And the way I memorize that is the word antheridia is close to the word antler, like anther and antler are very similar. And whenever I hear about antlers, I think about male deer. And that's how I remember that antheridia, antlers, male, sperm. So that's how I linked it in my head. So if that helps you, go for it. But antheridia makes sperm. And when you peer inside this region of the gametophyte, look at the antheridia, if you were to, crack it open and look inside, you see lots of sperm. Just like, similar to human physiology. Males produce lots of sperm. All right, so it's the same idea here with the bryophytes. And then the gametophyte also has to produce eggs. So the archegonia will be the site for that. And again, if you look at arch-egg, e.g., if you add just one more G, it's spelled egg. So archegonia produces eggs. Okay. Now, in this case, if you crack open the archegonia, one archegonium, and look inside, you'll see one big fat egg. That's it. There's not a lot of eggs. One. So again, one egg in each archegonium. And now somehow that sperm in the antheridia has to find that egg inside the archegonium. So we'll look at that in a minute. So in order for that to happen, you got to have free water. So rain, fog, some kind of film of water has to be employed in order to get the motile sperm capable of making it to the egg, and fertilizing the egg. If that happens, then we say fertilization has occurred, sperm and egg have fused. Then you start calling that cell the zygote. Now the zygote is just going to go through lots of mitosis, 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 growth, 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 and it's going to develop into the embryo. The embryo. Now that embryo is going to go through more growth, and it will then develop into the sporophyte phase of the bryophyte. So it takes a while, lots of cell division and growth, mitosis, mitosis, mitosis. But eventually you'll get a visible sporophyte phase that you can see with the naked eye. Now that it's in the sporophyte phase, it has the full complement of chromosomes in the sporophyte phase. It's 2N or diploid. So it's going to, well, let me put this out. This is an important concept. We'll see that this will shift over into some of the later groups of plants. But right now, with sporophyte in this group of plants, with the bryophytes, the sporophyte is attached and the sporophyte is dependent upon the gametophyte. That means that you cannot like detach the sporophyte and have it live on its own. It won't happen. It'll die. So the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte tissue, and I'll show you pictures. So, but it's still attached to it through the whole lifespan of the sporophyte phase. And so it's totally dependent on the gametophyte. It needs the gametophyte, especially to finish off its life. Initially, the sporophyte can do a little bit of photosynthesis, but then it gets so busy doing its job that it really does need the gametophyte to finish. So what is the job? The job of the sporophyte is to make spores. So it's right in the word. Sporophyte, sporo, spore, it's right in the word. So the sporophyte makes spores. Sporophyte makes spores. Sporophyte, spores. So, and again, there's usually a specialized region in the sporophyte tissue where you're going to see that happen. And that's the sporangium. And I need you to know that word too, because that term sporangium, again, it's going to follow us into the next group of plants. So the sporangium, anytime you see that word, it can be for plants, fungi, sporangium too. Anytime you see that word, just think about a specialized tissue. It often looks like a sac. And inside of that, that's where the spores are. It's just a piece of tissue that can hold the spores that are developing. So as the spores are forming and getting ready in the sporangium, the last thing that they have to accomplish before you can say they're fully mature is meiosis. You have to have that happen. And then after those spores go through meiosis, then they're ready to be dispersed out off the sporophyte. And hopefully the wind will take those spores and spread them into new habitats. So spores are a really good strategy for many living organisms. Bacteria do this, fungi do this, many plants do this. All right, so they want to get those spores airborne and out so that they can disperse and hopefully find good habitat to start to grow. Okay, so these two slides in words have described what the life cycle is like for the mosses. This next image is looking at it in context of the alternation of generation. Okay, so let's work through this. So you see this dividing dotted dashed line halfway down the image here. Okay, so that's the dividing line. So above that, in I guess that's peach colored, that's the gametophyte phase. The haploid phase, 1N or just N. So what you see here is that you have most mosses are what we call unisexual. Unisexual, did I say that right? Unisexual. There's like a male moss and then there's a female. You don't have one moss plant that has both male and female, right? So when you're out hiking around, some of those mosses that you look at will be the male and some will be the female. All right, so what we see here with the male, here they're showing what we call kind of a cushion moss where they kind of grow up off the substrate. And if you were hiking up to this, and if you look straight down on the moss, right at the very tip of the moss, if you look down, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second, that's where the antheridia are located. So right at the tip. So here they've blown up, they're showing a water droplet that's on the very tip of the moss. And then they're showing a close-up of the antheridia. So remember, the antheridia is just pieces of tissue where you're gonna have the sperm being produced. And so you can see that the antheridia are kind of these sac-like tissues, and they're all kind of like right next to each other, kind of sandwiched in there, right at the tip of the male gametophyte. They're trying to show that free water is necessary. All right, so that's why they have the raindrop here. And then they say, you know, there's lots and lots of sperm inside each antheridium. The rain comes along and splashes on that, and the sperm will get delivered in a raindrop, hopefully over to the female gametophyte. And again, typically with a lot of these mosses, it's at the very tip again that you're looking for where's the egg. And so that's where you see the archegonia. And in each archegonium, so that's singular, you say archegonium. In each archegonium, there's one big fat egg. And so the goal is get the sperm splashed over to the female moss where the archegonium are located. If that can happen successfully, then you get fertilization. The zygote and the embryo. And so now you can see what they're showing down here now. Right after the fertilization event there, they're showing that big egg is fertilized. So now they're calling it the zygote. So you can see that wherever the egg is located, that's where fertilization takes place. That's where the sporophyte is actually going to grow out of. Okay, so here with this zygote's going to go through lots of mitosis, growth, and develop into the sporophyte. So you can tell the difference. If there's a sporophyte phase developing, if you're out hiking around, it's very easy to tell the difference between a male moss and a female moss. Because you know, once you learn this, you know, well, the only way a sporophyte can form is if the egg got fertilized. And so if you see a sporophyte growing out, you know that's the female moss. So it's an easy way to tell. So that sporophyte will grow. And usually what we see with most mosses is that you'll get a sporophyte that has this kind of characteristic pattern of growth where it has a stalk that they often call a seta, S-E-T-A. It's basically just a stalk to raise up the sporophyte up into the air pretty nicely. Usually right at the very tip, that's where you find the sporangium. Because again, if you think about it, they want to get those spores up into the air current. So put everything up as high as you can, and then put your sporangium right at the tip so that when the spores are ready to go and that sporangium breaks open, it's going to hopefully get the spores up into the air current. So here you can see in this leftmost image that the sporophyte has shifted into this brown color. It's not doing photosynthesis anymore. It's too busy making spores to deal with that, really. And so it's dependent on the gametophyte. So it stays attached and is dependent on the gametophyte. And then once it's all done making spores, the very last thing it does is have those spores go through meiosis. And once you do that, you take the number of chromosomes and divide it in half. So that puts you back into the gametophyte phase. So if those spores get released and land onto a suitable habitat, then we say they germinate and grow. We actually use the word germination, even though it's not a seed per se, okay? But it's still going to germinate and grow and develop into a baby gametophyte. And that's going to be really hard to see with the naked eye. You'd have to get a hand lens and be crawling around on the forest floor. And then eventually you'll start to see the more obvious gametophyte moss in this case. Okay. questions on the alternate generation, specifically with moss? Kind of makes sense. I know it's a lot of terminology, I know. But the good news is, once you learn the terminology now, it's gonna be the same. Actually, you're gonna see all these things in Antheridium, Archegonium, zygote, embryo, sporophyte, gametophyte. All of that will show up again. Sporangium. Well, let's look at some mosses. So if you're out hiking around, you might see something like this. This is the gametophyte thing. Mosses are, there's a lot of diversity. They're incredibly beautiful. They're so cute. They're so tiny and petite. So this picture is showing kind of the two major growth morphologies. So the cushiony moss is on the left and is kind of what we just looked at in that artist rendition. We drew a where they kind of go up off the substrate. If you were to press on them, they're really light and cushy and soft. And then the feathery version on the right, where you can see some mosses almost look like fern leaves, but they're mosses. Okay, so you have a cushiony, feathery. Those are like the two major growth forms or morphologies of mosses. All right, so we have a lot of cushion mosses around here, some that are very kind of loose like this, and then you have like the pin cushion type that are grow very, very low to the substrate. So if you look down on a patch of mosses, you might see this, where you can tell that there's this kind of like lighter green area to the tip of the gametophyte. And that's, in this case, I can tell because my eye has been trained that this is a male moss and that it's in that light green area. That's where you're going to find all the antheridia with the sperm getting produced. So let's zoom into that light green tip and look at it under the microscope. This is what you would see. So they took that moss and kind of cut it longitudinally. And so this is the very tip of the male gametophyte. And so you can see all of this tissue. It just looks like kind of like a bunch of sausages all packed together. That's all antheridia. And then all the dark stuff, that dark blue, all of that is going to be sperm. So they just jam-packed full of sperm in each antheridium. So you have that going on with the male. This on the left is showing a female gametophyte, where you can just see it's a little hard, but that kind of that clearing area. So all the deep kind of red, that's the archegonia. And then you can see an egg forming in some of them, but not all. All right, and again, it's just one egg in each archegonium. The figure on the right is more antheridia that you're looking at for sperm. Here's another image with archegonia. And again, not all the archegonia have eggs yet, but this one you can see there's some egg development. It's hard to get a good prepared slide of archegonia. It's tricky because getting it cut at the right stage where there's a full mature egg ready to go, that's pretty challenging. But this one you can see they captured it pretty well on that, at least on that one archegonium. So if that archegonium, if that egg inside that archegonium gets fertilized, you have to imagine now it's going to start to grow and grow and grow and grow and start to form that stalk-like growth coming out of that. So that's what we're seeing in the next image. So this is a patch of female gametophytes, and then you can see wherever the sporophyte is, you know that's a female, because in order to get that sporophyte, you had to get that egg fertilized. And then you get the development of the sporophyte. So you can see initially these are young sporophytes. They're still, you can see the capsule area, the sporangium area is still green. The stalks tend to be kind of reddish purple initially, but then it'll shift. By the time the sporophyte is really mature and really cooking along, making spores, it looks more like this. So it looks kind of dry, brown, and they actually rely on drying out. They need to dry out a little bit in order for the sporangium to successfully rupture and release all the spores. So if you crack open and look inside one of the sporangium, here's a Bryum species, a little bit more ornate area of the sporangium, on this one anyways. Here's a really cool looking picture at the very tip of the sporangium. So it depends on the species. They can get quite ornate and beautiful, but this is, using a microscope to get this level of detail. So the spores, you can see the spores here were colored, so you could pick them out. If those get successfully released, first they go through meiosis, then they release out. And if they can land somewhere suitable, then they'll start to germinate and grow into something that looks like this, which you would have a hard time seeing with the naked eye. You would need a hand lens and get right up to it. And so they often use the word protonema. That's kind of an older term. I tend to just say baby gametophyte, but some of the slides in lab, you might see them labeled as protonema. That just means they're at the really young stage of gametophyte growth. And so it's the baby gametophyte that needs to grow and grow and grow and grow. Okay. So when we look at mosses, so we have mosses, liverworts, hornworts. Mosses win. There's more species of mosses out there than liverworts or hornworts for sure. And we say that they're radially symmetrical. When you look at the gametophyte of the moss, so if you look at a moss and you cut it in half, it doesn't really matter which way you make the slice. The two images will be mirror images. So radially symmetrical means that you can cut it in half any which way, and you can slice down the length of the gametophyte, and the two images will be mirror images, no matter how you slice it. So that's radial symmetry. We don't have that. Humans are bilaterals. There's only one way to cut us in half to get here, just straight down the middle. There's no other way to do it. All right. The gametophytes are usually a male gametophyte and then a separate female gametophyte. So they're unisexual typically. And then typically they'll form their Antheridion archegonia right at the tip. That's a good strategy because that's how you want things raised up off the substrate in order for successful fertilization and then successful dispersion of the spores. So unfortunately, there's several other organisms that have the word moss in them, and I just want to dispel some of the myths because you might have heard of Irish moss. That's not moss. Does anyone know what group of organisms Irish moss actually belong into? Think aquatic. They're actually algae. Irish moss are algae. So whoever named them moss should be, no. Reindeer moss. Does anyone know what reindeer moss really are? Lichen. Yeah, again, what are they thinking? It's a lichen. So that's a misnomer. Club moss, you might not be so familiar with that one. We have a lot of club mosses around here, and we'll talk about them eventually, but they're actually a totally different group of plants called the Ceiba vascular. So they're the next group of plants we'll talk about. And then Spanish moss, if you're from the South, you're probably very familiar with that term. Those are actually an angiosperm plant that's related to pineapples, even though it does not look anything like the pineapple plant at all. It's an epiphyte, which likes to hang out on trees. And I think it looks quite beautiful. When I travel down south and start getting into the southern areas and see all the Spanish moss, I think it's so beautiful. Although I heard some people don't like it, and I asked them why, and they said because if it blows into your yard, it usually carries a lot of insects with it that can then get into your home. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that I can see. But up in the trees, they're beautiful. So all of those are not true mosses. Mosses belong into the bryophyte group of plants. All of those are not true mosses. So here are just some beautiful images again. And so once the snow melts, eventually the snow's gonna melt. And you're out hiking around, you're gonna see some beautiful mosses showing up, and the sporophyte phase will start kicking in here in the early spring. This is from pictures from Olympic National Park. If any of you have gone there, I envy you. That's on my bucket list. I've got to get there because it just the number of mosses there is just incredible. Bryophytes in general, just incredible, and just incredibly gorgeous. So if you live in an area or visit these types of areas, you're very lucky. Lots of beautiful mosses. And again, they do like those moist habitats. So Olympic National Park is our only temperate rainforest in the United States. So it's an awesome place to be a moss and survive. And here, I just thought that was an awesome image. I didn't take this, but with the raindrops on the sporophyte. So just real pretty. Okay, so on Thursday, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about just general ecology, of bryophytes, and then I also need to talk to you about liverwort. Today in lab, you're probably going to get to see the liverwort as well, but I'll talk to you more about them on Thursday.